This is chapter 4.2. We left off last time talking about, sort of the frequency with which people are arrested for drug violations, how often that's in terms of possession, how often it's in terms of arrests, in terms of being incarcerated. I think the next point, an important thing to keep in mind too, is that that sometimes the statistics can be misleading, or the image can be misleading too, because again, you sometimes hear about a lot of these folks who are in jail or prison serving a sentence for, just possession of drugs, and it seems excessive and over the top to be, locking people up for some sort of minor possession. But realize too that part of the story here is that about 90% of all charges for crimes get plea bargained. Most of these cases do not go to court. They get plea bargained out between the lawyers. The prosecutor and defense attorneys will work out a deal. And very often what happens is that the person will end up with a conviction for possession when actually they were arrested and they were charged initially with sales, with something more serious, but they made a deal. The lawyers made a deal to avoid going to court. They made a deal that, hey, we'll reduce some sentences, we'll drop some charges, dismiss some charges, give you lesser charges, less serious ones, and instead of charging you with like sales, we'll charge you with possession. And so in exchange for you admitting that you are guilty, then we don't have to go to trial. And so some of these people who are in jail or in prison who look like they're drug possessors are actually, in fact, their behavior on the streets was sales, was manufacturing, was more involved in the business. But they ended up being, pleading guilty to some minor charge, something like possession. So keep in mind that's part of the story. As well. Another thing to keep in mind, which I haven't mentioned at all before, is that there's a problem that's been identified in the research, that you have roughly in the United States about 30,000 people arrested for drug violations because the drug test produced a false positive. Now remember, false positive, if you're not familiar with this term, this is so, you get drug tested. It comes back positive, meaning that you are positive for having having some illegal amount of some illegal substance in your body, but that test is giving an inaccurate result. It's saying you do have this in your system at a certain level when you don't. And so that happens about 30,000 times a year. And if you can put it in perspective, we saw how there were several 100,000 arrests per year for drug violations. And so that's not a big percentage. 30,000 is a small percentage, but that's a significant number and a noteworthy number, that this is a problem, that you do have some folks who are being brought in the system because the test is imperfect and is giving false positives. Now, I don't know how many times it's given false negatives when you're actually high, or and the test comes back that you're not. I don't know how much it goes the other way, but anyway, this is something to keep in mind. This 30,000. The textbook stresses the high percent of drug offenders in federal prison. They give a statistic which I did not include, that a lot of people who are in federal prison are there for drug-related charges. And what we need to keep in mind there is that the only types of crimes that the federal government has jurisdiction over are big types of criminal operations that engage in business, quote unquote business, across state lines. So as long as you're just some small little drug user or drug dealer within a local area and you're not crossing state lines, you're staying within the state, engaging in your legal activities, well, there's a good chance that the federal government has no jurisdiction over your criminal activities. It would be the local system, criminal justice system, that would have jurisdiction over you. So it's not a surprise that most of the people who are in prison at the federal level are there for drug violations and also for the sort of immigration violations as well, um, because that's what the federal government is concerned with, crimes that are happening in a large scale across multiple states, even internationally, trafficking across countries, and that's the federal jurisdiction, just like immigration laws are federal laws. And so it's no surprise that you see lots of numbers of these individuals in federal prisons. But I suspect that sometimes the focus in the statistics is in federal prisons, which are most inmates, uh, who are incarcerated around the United States are not incarcerated at the federal level. That's a small percentage of all inmates. Most inmates are at the state level, whether they be in prisons or whether they be in local jails. That's where most people who are convicted of crimes or maybe awaiting trial in jail too. Most folks are there, the vast majority. It's only a smaller percentage who are incarcerated at the federal level. So it's a little misleading to focus on the federal level to, as if to make it seem like the criminal justice system only seems to care about drug offenders and lets everybody else go free, or doesn't prioritize severity of crimes by focusing a lot on the federal prisons. Federal prisons have a different job, different responsibilities, different jurisdiction. And so really, if you want to give a picture of what inmates look like across the country, that's a most common, biggest picture, you need to look at state prisons. You need to look at jails. And there you're going to see much smaller percentages of inmates who were there because they were convicted of some drug offense, because at the state level, they're dealing with all different types of criminals, violent criminals, thieves, et cetera, et cetera. And so you're going to see significantly lower percent of people locked up for drug-related offenses at the local level jails and prisons as opposed to the federal prisons. So just keep that in mind. Drug-related crimes are offenses that do not involve the violation of a drug law per se, but rather involve a violation of a law of some other type. Killing someone under the influence of meth, I put in there as an example. See the graphs below. So what they're getting at here is that if you commit a crime that is connected to drugs, but you're actually, committing a crime that's not drugs, that, you're drunk, and so you attack and kill somebody while you're under the influence of alcohol. That would be an example of this drug-related crime where drugs are involved. Alcohol, in this case, is involved, but the crime that you committed is actually killing someone, intentional killing of somebody. So that's what they mean by drug-related offenses. And there's graphs below that I want to discuss. Let's get to those to look at this sort of issue of drug-related crimes. Now, there's a whole page here, which probably makes sense to cover these after I cover the graphs. Now, I've got a couple of these, these visuals here that are pulled from the textbook, and here's the first one. And you can see in the title that this is the Goldstein tripartite model of drugs and violence, showing the importance of distinguishing three major types of drug-related, and here our focus is on violence, as opposed to like property crime or other sorts of crimes. So we're talking about drug-related crime, specifically violence. And so there's three kinds of violence that can happen that are drug-related, according to this Goldstein model. And those are divided into the pharmacological violence as one type. We'll cover that in a moment. Economically compulsive violence. And the third one is called systemic violence. And so three different types of drug-related violence. So let's get into the specifics. What do they mean by pharmacological violence? Okay, they're talking about you take some drug. It has an impact on the functioning of your brain, impact on your emotions, on your perceptions, and on your behavior. And so you end up committing violence because this drug is contributing to your behavior. It's a physiological sort of effect, right? So ingestion of drugs causing an individual to become excitable, irrational, or inclined to exhibit violent behavior. So someone, someone gets, again, the alcohol is a very common example. I sort of like to go to that one just because it's so common. So someone gets drunk, and in that drunken state, they attack somebody violently. The second type here is economically compulsive violence. This is the need for money to buy drugs as the primary motivation for violence. So so this is someone very often, a common scenario here is, let's say you're a drug addict and you need to get your drugs one way or another. And so let's say you go rob somebody at the point of a gun, you stick a gun in somebody's face, that's a violent crime. You steal their money so that you can go pay for some drugs because you're addicted and you feel like you really, really need them. That's economically compulsive violence. You're driven by your addiction to commit crimes that are sort of economic in nature. You're trying to get money. You're trying to get valuables. I mean, it could even be direct sort of thing where you attack the drug dealer and steal from the drug dealer his drugs to get your hit, right? So it's the compulsive is key here, that it drives you. You're driven to commit violence to get drugs very often, or it's out of this deep need, right? Usually it's going to be addiction. Systemic violence, that's the third type. This is sort of violence that comes along with the quote unquote the business of drug dealing, right? It's kind of a negative, unfortunate consequence of illegal market of drugs, legal drug business, gangs, cartels, etc., that they sometimes commit violence as part of their business. And so that's what we're talking about with systemic violence, disputes over territory between rival gang dealers. So let's say you got a couple of gangs that want to control a neighborhood and be the only one that sell drugs in that neighborhood to make the profit off of it. So you got two rivals. Well, how do we decide who gets to control that neighborhood? Well, they fight it out. They use violence and as a form of competition. And the winner gets to control the territory and the loser loses and does not control the territory. So you also have, that's like a competition sort of violence, but you can also have violent acts committed to enforce discipline. What you'll learn if you study gangs or organized crime is that violence is part of the business. And one way that the violence gets used is that these organizations end up kind of being their own criminal justice system. Since they can't go to police officers to report being victimized or to report bad behavior, criminal behavior, they have to take care of that bad behavior themselves. So if some gang member is stealing money from the gang, you don't go to the police to handle that problem. You take the justice punishment in your own hands. And so maybe you give that gang member a good beating, violence, to discipline him for stealing. There's many, many different ways that an organized crime, that a drug gang will use violence to keep people under control. That's a big difference, very big difference between organized crime and legitimate businesses. Legitimate businesses don't use violence, illegal violence, typically to control people or to win their competitions. Organized crime gangs are very willing and use violence to further the interests, the goals of the gang, of this profit-making enterprise. And so, you might, a couple other examples they give here, you might eliminate police informants. You might punish people for selling bad drugs, adulterated drugs. Somebody's cheating, somebody's messing with the drugs and causing your business trouble. You want to have a smooth operation that doesn't draw any attention. You don't want people getting poisoned from your drugs, which is going to bring the heat of law enforcement, etc., the anger from the public. Punishment for defrauding the drug dealer. So again, it's kind of think of it as a criminal justice function where you punish bad behavior, not by running to the police, but by taking matters into your own hands. So 3 different types of ways that drugs can lead to violence. Make sure that you are familiar with those 3. We'll stop here, but in the next segment, we'll talk about how all of these apply to property crime and other sorts of crimes other than just violent crime.